The air inside the control room was thick with the hum of servers and the low murmur of panic. It was May 7, 2021. The clock on the wall read 7:30 p.m. Outside, the sun was setting over the Georgia suburbs, but inside the digital nervous system of the United States, a storm was already raging. The screens were flashing red. Not a glitch. Not a routine maintenance alert. A digital lock had been thrown on the master keys. The man who held them was in a dark room, thousands of miles away, demanding a payment that would make the entire nation hold its breath. In a matter of hours, the largest fuel pipeline in North America had been severed from its own mine. The engines of commerce, the planes, the trucks, the hospitals, the homes, they were all about to run on fumes. And the only thing standing between the United States and a total energy collapse was a single, terrifying question: would the ransom be paid? Before the panic, there was only the routine. Colonial Pipeline was the artery of the East Coast, a 5,500-mile-long artery of steel buried beneath the earth, pumping gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and heating oil from the Gulf Coast to the New York harbor. It moved roughly 100 million gallons of fuel every single day. It was a logistical miracle, a silent workhorse that kept the American economy breathing. The company was a subsidiary of a massive German energy conglomerate, Centrica, but in the eyes of the public, it was just a utility. A necessity. The employees were proud of the infrastructure they managed, treating the control centers with a sense of quiet reverence. They believed they were safe. They believed that the physical barriers of steel and concrete were enough to keep the digital world at bay. They were wrong. They were operating in a world that had quietly shifted beneath their feet, where the most dangerous weapons were no longer made in factories, but written in lines of code. The people behind the attack were not nation-state spies, not the shadowy figures of a foreign government trying to disrupt a democracy. They were something new. They were criminals, but they had evolved. They had become a business. The group calling themselves DarkSide was a criminal syndicate operating out of Eastern Europe, but they had rebranded themselves as a service provider. They were offering ransomware as a service, a subscription model for cybercrime. They were the dark side of the gig economy. They didn't care about ideology. They didn't care about politics. They cared about profit margins. And they had found a target that was too big to ignore, a target that was vulnerable not because of a lack of security, but because of a lack of imagination. The world was rushing toward a digital future, but the guardians of that future were still thinking in terms of locks and keys, not in terms of the invisible, fluid nature of the Internet. The story began on a Tuesday evening. A routine administrative task. An employee at Colonial Pipeline, likely unaware of the gravity of the action, opened an email. It looked innocent. A request for a password reset. A link that looked like a standard corporate portal. But it was a trap, a digital hook baited with the promise of a simple solution. The click was all it took. The malware slipped through the front door, hiding in the shadows of the network. It didn't go for the control systems immediately. That would have been too obvious. It went for the backup. It went for the file servers. It began to encrypt, one by one, the digital records that kept the pipeline running. It was a slow, methodical creep. By the time the system administrators noticed the slowdown, the infection had already spread to the backup servers, cutting off the only way to restore the data. The realization hit the command center like a physical blow. The screens went dark. The dashboard that showed the flow of fuel, the pressure in the pipes, the status of the pumps, it was all gone. In its place was a single, glaring message. A red screen with a skull icon. It demanded 75 Bitcoin. That was the price of the keys. That was the price of the fuel. The message was clear: pay or the lights go out. The pipeline was paralyzed. The trucks were stopped at the terminals. The refineries were shut down. The entire East Coast was suddenly facing a crisis that no one had anticipated. The hackers were watching. They were waiting. They knew that the American people would not tolerate a lack of gas for long. They knew that the government would step in. They knew that the clock was ticking. How did they do it? How did a group of criminals bring down a critical infrastructure giant with a single click? The answer lies in the architecture of the modern world. Colonial Pipeline, like many legacy industrial systems, had a hybrid network. They had their operational technology, the systems that actually controlled the pumps and valves, and they had their corporate information technology, the email, the file servers, the HR databases. These two worlds were supposed to be separated by a firewall, a digital wall. But the firewall had a door. A door that was left open. The attackers had exploited a vulnerability in a remote access tool. They didn't need to break down the wall, they just needed to find the key that the employee had left under the mat. Once inside the corporate network, they moved laterally. They didn't just stop at the email server. They scanned the network, looking for other doors, other windows. They found the backup servers. They found the administrative credentials. And then, they executed the payload. The ransomware itself was a sophisticated piece of malware known as Black Hat, or ALPHV. It was designed to be stealthy and destructive. It encrypted the data with military-grade algorithms, making it mathematically impossible to unlock without the private key held by the attackers. But it did more than just lock the files. It began the process of exfiltration. While the company was scrambling to pay the ransom, the hackers were downloading terabytes of data. They were stealing customer records, employee personal information, and proprietary operational data. They were holding this data hostage as well, threatening to release it if the ransom wasn't paid. It was a double extortion strategy, a tactic that maximized the pressure on the victim. The hackers knew that Colonial Pipeline had no choice. They couldn't afford the reputational damage of a data leak, nor could they afford the physical shutdown of the pipeline. The impact was immediate and visceral. By the time the news broke, the panic had already set in. Gas stations began to run dry. Long lines formed at the pumps, stretching for blocks. The fear was palpable. People were hoarding fuel, filling up their cars, their trucks, their generators. The price of gasoline began to climb. The government stepped in, declaring a state of emergency. The Department of Energy was brought in. The FBI was mobilized. The pressure was immense. The company was forced to make a decision that went against every security protocol in the book. They had to pay. They had to pay the ransom to get the keys back. It was a moral dilemma that haunted the industry for years. Pay the criminals and fund their operations, or let the nation run on fumes. They chose to pay. The payment was made. 75 Bitcoin, roughly $4.4 million at the time. The transaction was recorded on the blockchain, a permanent, unchangeable record of the crime. But the money didn't go far. The FBI, working with the Department of Justice, traced the funds. They followed the digital trail through the mixers, the tumblers, the chains of transactions. It was a cat-and-mouse game in the digital ether. The hackers had used a mix of cryptocurrency exchanges and peer-to-peer trading to try to wash the money. But the FBI was relentless. They identified the wallet addresses. They identified the individuals behind the screens. The arrest warrant was issued. The man behind the keyboard, a man in his early 20s, was identified. He was arrested in Eastern Europe. He was extradited. The keys were returned. The data was decrypted. The pipeline began to flow again. But the damage was done. The trust was broken. The world had seen the vulnerability of its critical infrastructure. The ripple effects were profound. The Colonial Pipeline attack was a wake-up call. It proved that cyberattacks were not just theoretical threats or nuisance crimes. They were existential risks. It showed that a small group of criminals could hold a superpower hostage. It forced a reckoning in the world of cybersecurity. Companies were forced to reevaluate their security postures. The old model of defense in depth was no longer enough. The assumption that the network was safe as long as the perimeter was secure was dead. The focus shifted to zero-trust architectures, where every access request is verified, where no device or user is trusted by default. It changed the conversation around ransomware. Governments began to pass stricter regulations. The FBI launched new task forces dedicated to disrupting ransomware gangs. The game had changed. The criminals had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. The lessons learned from the Colonial Pipeline attack are stark and unforgiving. The first is that legacy systems are not immune. The age of the Industrial Revolution is not over, it has just merged with the digital age. The pipelines, the power grids, the water treatment plants, they are all running on software that was designed decades ago, often without the security features we take for granted today. The second lesson is that human error is the weakest link. No amount of expensive software can stop a single click from a distracted employee. The third lesson is that the cost of prevention is always less than the cost of recovery. The $4.4 million paid in ransom was just the tip of the iceberg. The cost of the downtime, the lost revenue, the reputational damage, the legal fees, and the eventual upgrades to the security infrastructure ran into the hundreds of millions. The attackers had found a way to turn a vulnerability into a revenue stream, and they had done it on a scale that was unprecedented. The world is watching. The next attack is coming. It will not be a small hack. It will be a strike that targets the very foundations of our society. The question is not if, but when. And when it happens, we will be reminded of the night the fuel stopped flowing. We will be reminded of the power of a single click. We will be reminded that in the digital age, the most dangerous weapon is not a bomb, but a password. The game is over. The rules have changed. The only question left is whether we are ready to play. The next time you turn on your faucet, or turn the key in your car, or flip the switch on your wall, remember the Colonial Pipeline. Remember the night the world held its breath. And ask yourself, what else is connected? What else is vulnerable? The answer might be closer than you think. In the next episode of CipherTrace, we peel back the layers of another digital heist, one that targets the very heart of the banking system. A heist where the money wasn't stolen with a gun, but with a glitch in the code. A heist that left the world's financial institutions shaking. The mystery is deeper, the stakes are higher, and the truth is more terrifying. Stay tuned. The code is waiting.